It was around 3 years back that I attended a session on brain-based coaching, and I have been curious about the relationship between the brain and learning. In fact, you would notice this curiosity coming across in a lot of my relearning podcasts too. Hi, I'm Prashant, a learning enthusiast, and you are listening to the Relearning Podcast. Today we have Dr. Colleen Lightbody, who facilitated this brain-based coaching 3 years back, and that has left an everlasting impact on me. Today we shall talk about how does brain learn. Colleen is popularly known as the brain guru for her work in the field of neuroscience, mindfulness, learning, transformational coaching, and emotional intelligence. She is master certified coach, PhD in philosophy, MPhil in leadership, postgraduate in neuro leadership, BA honors in psychology. No, I'm not done yet. Colleen is an avid cyclist. She has completed 3 full Ironman challenges and has run many marathon triathlons, hundreds of ultra distance races, and has climbed Kilimanjaro and Everest Base Camp. She is rightly so called as Linus mom at home by her kids. Welcome to the show, Colleen.
Thank you, Prashant. It's a great honor to be here.
The honor is all mine. So first things first, right? How does a human brain learn?
Okay, a small question with a big answer. So I think what's important to remember is that when we're learning anything, we want to leverage the brain in the best way possible. And it amazes me how, as much as we know about neuroscience and how the brain works at the moment, how so many learning techniques, learning applications or methodologies are actually ignoring basic brain function. So, and brain structure for that matter. So, but I think one of the most important things is that people start to understand how the brain works so that they can understand how to learn better. And there's many aspects to learning as well, Prashant. There's memorizing, retrieving, recalling. It's about putting information into short-term memory, putting information into long-term memory. It's depending on what you want to do with the information. What is the quality of learning that you want to occur? We can even talk about creating unconscious learning, learning which is embedded in our unconscious and becomes automatic, as opposed to cognitive or thinking or intellectual learning. So perhaps we can go with a few specifics and then see where we go in the whole talk.
Sure. So one of the interesting things that we always come across, and this happens at corporates and in general also for many, is that we normally have existing knowledge and which affects the way we learn anything new probably, or in the parlance of this podcast also, anything to relearn as well. So what are your thoughts on the existing knowledge, the baggage that we have on our brain, which is in some corner of the brain as a memory? Does that hinder in the learning process as such?
Well, it can certainly hinder, but it can certainly help as well. So what we have to remember is that essentially, and obviously, Prashant, whenever I'm talking in very simple language for an incredibly complex organ. So just trying to simplify it as much as we can. But basically, we're looking at two critical parts of learning or memory. The first is short-term memory, and the second would be long-term memory. So I think really what you're talking about here is how does our long-term memory, how does all our life experiences, all the knowledge that we've gathered, that everything that we have that is part of our entire experience, how does that impact us when we're learning something new? And I guess there's good and bad.
Yeah.
Good would be really that without long-term knowledge, without having built up capacity and wisdom and understanding throughout our lifetime, it becomes very difficult to accumulate new knowledge. So for example, one of my best examples always is just if you think about mathematics.
Right.
If a child, what happens is, how does a child learn, or how does a human learn? First of all, we start by learning our numbers. Then we learn addition. Then we learn multiplication and division and long division. And eventually we learn algebra, geometry, and then finally calculus. Now, we cannot learn calculus if we don't know our numbers.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of building process. I always use the metaphor of building bricks in a wall, where it's one brick at a time. And one of the problems very much, which we see in our schooling systems and we see in our corporate situations as well, is sometimes there is a missing brick in the wall. Either a person missed out in a certain part of learning, or it wasn't well explained to them, and so they created a distorted experience of, I don't know, learning multiplication or grammar or whatever it is. And then what happens, you've got this, if you create a visual in your mind, you've got these bricks in the wall, and in the middle there's a missing brick. What's going to happen to the wall? It's going to collapse.
Right.
So the quality of the learning that you've done throughout your lifetime is pretty important. But it doesn't necessarily, because one of the things we need to help people become aware of is when they have a missing brick in the wall. So whether it's in what you're doing in your workplace, or whether it's learning physics at university, often when a person gets stuck, in fact, almost inevitably, Prashant, in my experience,
right.
The person gets stuck, it's not because they're stupid. It's not because they don't have the capacity to learn. And in fact, I'll talk about that as well.
Sure.
People have the capacity to learn, but it's often just in the wall. And that can frequently be overcome by merely going and revisiting, where is it that the missing space was? What did I lose out on? Which can be quite simply, say at a university student level, going back to where they last understood everything, and then taking it one step at a time, moving forward and discovering and filling in the missing brick in the wall, so that they can then add the bricks too, which is what we're doing when we're learning something new.
It's very interesting point, right? Many a times I realize, and this is how I started the podcast also, we take things for granted, many things for granted. And as we get into the complexity of the problems, we assume certain things and we take the basics for granted, and we tend to also forget them at times. And that's why does going back to basics help in such situations? I don't have an example. Maybe I could try that, while doing calculus, and there's a famous, I'm not sure if it's a joke or a fact, that Einstein could solve the most problematic equations in the world, but at the same time, the simple maths problem could be a challenge for him. But how true is that?
I would say there's probably a bit of a distorted story, but what
Right.
you often find is with people with a high, and then we can talk about what is intellectual intelligence versus
Right.
spatial intelligence versus emotional intelligence, etc. But you often find that kind of the brain almost needs balance. And what you'll find is if a person has a particular certain area, often there's less of a skill in another area. So an extreme example would be, for example, an autistic child. If you've ever seen many
Right.
autistic childs have incredible capabilities. Some of them, I don't know, they can just sit down and create beautiful music on the piano, or they can paint, or they can remember what the weather was on the 7th of January 1999. So they have this incredible skill, but what they have is low, often emotional skills.
Uh-huh.
See that it's a bit of a generic example, but in the mad professor kind of stereotype or archetype, which I suppose we think about Einstein. I mean, if you see pictures of him, he certainly looks like a mad professor, where he's got this amazing academic, intellectual, scientific or mathematical intellect, and yet perhaps his emotional intelligence wasn't quite as at that level. But just to answer your first question, I don't think it's always going back to the basics, because learning what it is that we didn't know. And I think this often happens in organizations where a manager or a leader will perceive that the person in their team is lazy, or they'll perceive that they're stupid, or they'll perceive that they're resistant. And in actual fact, often it's just because the person doesn't truly understand. Now, also another important fact about the brain here is we have to understand there's an absolute rule, which no two brains are alike. And Prashant, I'd love to give you a formula for how to learn anything, but your brain will learn in a particular way, my brain way. So that manager or leader needs to understand that nobody's resistant, stupid, or idiot, or lazy. People aren't when they're in their wisdom. They only become that way when they're insecure, or when they're afraid, or when they're uncertain. And so that often looks as though it's an impediment to learning. But in actual fact, what we need to get over is the emotional boulder that's in the way of that person navigating their learning journey. And I think the same thing for kids, passionate about this. Often in schooling systems, you know, there's a scary teacher, or the dreaded exams, you know.
Right.
I know in India, the pressure and the expectations that are put around getting high marks, that in itself often creates people that look as though they're not competent, but in actual fact, it's only the fear or the anxiety that is overcoming them and making them incapable of actually being able to put onto a piece of paper what they actually really know or have learned.
Yeah. And many such examples, right? And I was just reading this post yesterday that, I learned about H2O and what does it mean, and I learned about how multiplications or the table of 13 really works. But what I would have been happy to learn as an adult is what is emotional intelligence? What exactly does it mean to be a kind? What exactly is mindfulness? These are the things would have helped me if I would have got introduced at least in my school age. So that's what I read yesterday, and that stayed
Yeah.
in my memory.
Prashant, number one is, I always say the stuff that I teach students, or I teach people how to learn, I should actually be teaching the teachers, because the
Right.
teachers need to understand the importance of a positive brain state. And I can talk about the neurochemistry in the brain in order for a person to learn. If there's a negative brain state, it creates what it does is it actually supports the production of neuroinhibitors, okay, neurochemicals that don't facilitate the transfer of information. So just being scared, the child is looking incompetent, whereas in actual fact, it's the fear that we need to get through first. Okay, so yes, I would say we need to teach teachers, we need to teach leaders, we need to teach managers about how to handle people before we try and get them to transfer learning. And then I just, sorry, Prashant, I can't resist it, but another fun thing you said,
Sure.
about H2O. And I mean, that's, it's one of kind of my mean tricks that I can play in the classroom. And I say, how do you write down H2O? And everyone goes H2O, actually HIJK LMNOP, kind of, it's kind of lateral thinking. So
Yeah.
that's maybe what you were talking about earlier. What it is that we've learned before always makes us think in the same old way. And often we don't think out of the box. We don't think laterally of what else could this be, or what else could it look like. And then that brings me to a wonderful book you can read. It's by a psychologist at Harvard University by the name of Ellen Langer, who wrote a book called Mindfulness.
Yeah.
Prashant, I mean, I'm very passionate about mindfulness. But she actually doesn't talk about mindfulness from the spiritual tradition that you and I probably think about it, or consciousness. She talks about it as being mindful of novelty, mindful of differences. And she says that when we teach people to learn, instead of teaching a kid about, I don't know, this is the heart, okay, in biology, you go, what could this be? What could this not be? What do you think is possible? What do you think is not possible? So if you can see, it's actually helping children to look at much more evocative way of learning, rather than just literally, this is a heart and this is what it does. Isn't that interesting?
Interesting. Very interesting. But thanks. In fact, visited your TED talk on mindfulness, and that was very interesting as well. Very different than what would one normally see in a mindfulness session.
Yeah. So that's kind of what I've done through my PhD. I've tried to integrate Eastern and Western conceptions of mindfulness. So yes, mindfulness is based in ancient spiritual traditions, but how do we, to bring kind of those ancient spiritual traditions into the boredom in the Western world can often be quite a challenge. So what I've done is I've explored, consciousness, intentionality, as well as presence, and all of those, and meditation, and all of those. For me, if we can just relate this back to learning, because I'm very passionate about bringing mindfulness into learning. Mostly what people are doing when they're learning something, and it's not only happening in a classroom situation or in a corporate situation,
Right.
but even individuals sabotage themselves by sitting and being mindless while they're learning. So my daughter sitting and dreaming of her boyfriend while she's sitting for an hour and a half in her desk. That's mind wandering, mindless activity.
Right.
And in order to learn mindful, we need to be paying attention. We need to be present with whatever the information is that we're learning. So, and often just teachers aren't taught this, students aren't taught this, leaders aren't taught this, that you can do all the teaching in the world, but if a person is not present, no learning is going to occur. Now, short-term memory is obviously directly connected. Well, it is your prefrontal cortex, which is your thinking, rational, conscious brain.
Right.
Okay. So this conscious brain is a brain that only human beings have a prefrontal cortex. And this is the part of the brain we need present when we're learning new information. So if I had to say to you, Prashant, I really hope you know the answer to this question. Okay. What is 2 times 2?
4. Thanks. That was fast.
What is 3 plus 3?
6. I'm doing good. Thank you.
You're doing well.
Yeah.
What is 37 times 45?
Let me come back to you.
Okay, exactly. So the first 2 are in your long-term memory. And I know it might seem easy to you, but I can tell you what this 6-year-old Prashant had to learn, what 2 times 2 and 5 times 5 were. But when I say 37 times 46, if you had learned your 37 times table up to 46, you'd be able to say it to me because it would be embedded in your long-term memory. But instead it's in your, we had to activate your short-term memory. You can see you laughed, which was a little bit of adrenaline, a little bit of serotonin and dopamine being released in your brain because it was novelty. It was unexpected. It was something unusual. And there was a bit of, I've got to think really hard about this. When I said 2 plus 2, you just come up with the answer. So what we were doing is whenever we try to put something into short-term memory, that's the 37 times 45, it takes effort. It takes focus. It takes attention. And that is what I'm talking about if we're not mindful, if we're not present, we cannot learn. If you don't pay attention, we cannot learn anything. And we've created these myths and we've created these habits but in actual fact, multitasking is a myth. It is neurologically impossible for the brain to do more than one cognitive task at a time without becoming deficient and sabotaging it. So I know you probably heard about this 7 plus minus 2, and that, which is true, but it's kind of 7 in a processing way. There's no ways that you can hold 7 conscious thoughts in your mind at one time. What you can do is swap between them, but you can't hold them in the mind at one time. So we don't understand that in order to engage our brain effectively, the first and most important thing is we need to pay attention.
Very interesting. When you said you have to activate the prefrontal cortex, it's to get the excitement going. Where does, I'm going to the way we learn, right? And typically this happens when we start easy. You are excited for the response. That is, you probably are expecting a better easy question again, or something that you know about. And then there is a challenging question. What happens? What literally happens? Because there are many, like, and I know of this about the fight, flight, and freeze. The response, these responses could really occur when there's an uncertain situation or unexpected situation. How does brain work around that? Because that can have a long-term impact on many things.
Okay, so your prefrontal cortex is actually, in actual fact, not your emotional brain as such. And I know I'm using very absolute terms in talking about the brain, so it helps us to understand it better.
Sure,
the prefrontal cortex,
cognitive
reasoning, decision-making, understanding it. So we focus with our prefrontal cortex, we pay attention. But what we're doing is that is how we create memories in the short term, or knowledge in the short term. What we're wanting to do is we wanted to embed those memories in our long-term memory. Now, your long-term memory, it's called the hippocampus. It's like hangs out right in the middle of the limbic system, the instinctive brain. This long-term memory is wrapped around by your emotional brain. Literally, the emotional part of the brain, also in the center of the brain, surrounds our long-term memory. So what we say in learning is, if we want and embed it in our memory, we need to do it by creating a positive emotional state. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, Prashant, equally, it can sound like a bit of a contradiction, but if you had a huge fright, if something very dramatic, or if you've ever had terrible news at any time in your life, you will remember that for the rest of your life. It will be burnt into your long-term memory. But now I've just said to you, you need a positive brain state to remember things. Do that when you've had a shocking event or terrible news, you remember it. But the problem is that when we have a negative brain state, we don't create accurate memories. So what you think that you remember from that very difficult time of your life or difficult experience is actually not accurate.
Oh, how do you mean?
If we, somebody who has, I'm a trauma counselor, it's another thing that I do is I help people understand how the brain works in traumatic situations. And if I have a group of people who've been through the same trauma, each one of them has a story about the situation that happened.
I'm sorry, Colleen, I lost your voice. You're saying if there are people who are witnessing a story, each one of a trauma story, each one will have a different story. That's what you're saying?
Exactly. And what I said was that there is actually no such thing as eyewitness testimony that is completely valid. The researcher her name is Elizabeth Loftus. She's very famous. She travels around the world and she often invited, you might have heard of it. She's often invited to testify about how our experiences are completely distorted in traumatic situations. So if we take it all the way back to learning, what we want to do is we want to have positive, not too excited, by the way, because if you're too excited, you're not going to learn anything anyway, but erring on the side of positive brain state in order to embed accurate information in your long-term memory. Interesting. You can actually plant false memories quite easily, incredibly easily, actually. It's quite frightening. The traumatic experience is the traumatic experience. We're not invalidating it. But what I'm saying is the accuracy of your memories of the event will be distorted.
Very interesting.
So I think that's what I'm really talking about when I talk, whether it's me as a professional coach, me as a professional trainer of neuroscience, me as a teacher. It's my job to create a safe space to facilitate another person's brain and another person's thinking. And that's when people find wisdom. That's when people are able to learn.
Interesting. And thank you again for that beautiful answer. When I researched about brain or things that are happening around us, there are so many myths, neuro myths as they call. What are some frequent neuro myths that literally happen or you come across at all times that generally people know about it, but they're literally myths? Example one you already spoke of is multitasking.
Yeah, absolutely. That's probably the most of our times. It's probably one of the most damaging myths. Neuro myths. So I think the interesting thing about neuro myths is that they're often embedded in some level of truth. It's just this, or the statement is languaged that makes it inaccurate, and therefore people sort of carry on believing that for the rest of their life. So let me give you a few. The kind of common myth of we're only using 2% or 5% or 10% of our brain, that's what people say. But in actual fact, we use our whole brain. It's 2 or 5, or I've heard it. You had another professional on saying 0.000 whatever the percentage is, it's that capacity of our brain. Right. So often people just leave out the word capacity, So we use our whole brain, and that's what I do in everything I do is teaching people how to use their whole brain, how to use like learning, for example. How do we use our visual cortex? How do you use your motor cortex? Active learning. Those teachers that took you into the garden and walked you and you spoke and you taught each other. You're using your social brain. You're using your auditory brain. The more parts of the brain you use, the better you embed information and the more effectively you learn. So that's where a myth can go wrong, because people then they make excuses for themselves. I'm only using 2% of my brain. No, you're using your whole brain, and the more you use your whole brain, the more effective you'll be.
Interesting.
And then the left brain, right brain story. People aren't left brain or right brain. Again, we're whole brain. But where the essence of truth in that is that we process more literal, not so much fact-based, but linear kind of thinking in our left hemisphere, and we process more creative thinking in the right hemisphere. And by the way, we process more positive emotions in our left and more negative emotions in our right. But again, we whole brain. So people are not left brain or right brain. We use our whole brain, but often people will have a tendency to think more negative with more negative emotions, or have a tendency to think in more linear ways.
In fact, I did an episode, the shorty episode on this, and the episode ends with saying that, some next time when you get something like this as a psychometric test, do it for fun, for sure, but let it not affect or guide you on what you should do and what you should not.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you mentioned psychometric tests, and I want to run for the hills, because unfortunately, that's, I think, another thing that happens, and how people, because I don't believe that any psychometric test is accurate. I mean, maybe there's tendencies, maybe there's nuance. People do is they buy into the story. I mean,
Right.
These brain things where you're a red or a blue, and I'm sorry, I'm probably being quite controversial here.
Sure,
The
please.
personality test, or whether you are a visual learner, auditory learner. So people buy into it, and then they put a box around who they are. But because of neuroplasticity, because of the capacity that we have in our brain that is beyond our wildest imaginings, what these labels do is they just box us. I don't say never have assessments, I mean, obviously they're part of our lives, but I'm saying, but look at those assessments and take them and say, how can I make this useful? What do I do differently? What would I like to show? Because we have the capacity to change right throughout our lifetimes because of neuroplasticity.
I call this the zodiac effect, right? So
Okay.
because so I mean that's my personal take on this, that psychometric tests are like those zodiacs. So
Yeah.
you know that you are a Gemini, so you're dual face. So every time
Yeah.
I will box myself as a Gemini who has two sides of it. But that's bad, because you are actually telling your brain that you have this side at all times. So make good use of it. That's what you're trying to say, right?
Yeah.
You
100%.
coined a beautiful word, neuroplasticity, and like a good host and knowledgeable host, I'll say I probably understand, and if you can simplify it for my listeners.
Okay, so I think neuroplasticity is at the heart, and kind of why I've changed my life so profoundly to teach about the brain, because neuroplasticity talks to the fact that the brain is malleable, the brain is changeable, and it's changeable right throughout your lifetime. So you have the capacity to do things differently. More specifically, if I'm focusing my brain in any one particular area, okay, using one part of my brain in the strongest way, that part of my brain becomes strong. Okay, so for example, I don't know, Einstein will have a stronger, thicker, and denser prefrontal cortex because he's using his brain for academic cognitive thinking all the time.
Right.
A artist will have a stronger, thicker, and denser visual cortex. There's also a story going around, which I've done quite a bit of research about it. Sometimes they say it's a myth, sometimes it's actually reported as accurate, that Einstein had a bump on the top of your brain, which is to do with sensory motor integration, because of the kind of the out of the box work he was doing. But I still haven't confirmed whether that's actually true or not. But it is true that whichever part of your brain you're using, that part becomes stronger, thicker, and denser. So that's neuroplasticity. And it's not only the fact that we have the capacity to change, but we've actually got responsibility for how we craft our brain. It's our whatever our outcomes are, whatever kind of brain we carry in our heads, it's up to us to actually spend enough time and attention crafting the brain that we want. So when we're not mindful, when we're jealous, when we're angry, when we're resentful, when we talk negatively to ourselves, what we're doing is choosing to craft a brain. And it's a very interesting thing, Prashant. It's a concept called it's not a concept, but it's a plasticity paradox. Okay, so that whichever part of our brain we use, okay, we create we can change that part of our brain. But the paradox is that the more we do it, the more rigid that part becomes. So we need to be very careful about what we want to embed in our brains as kind of a permanent part of us.
Very
so it's a bit of a paradox.
Yeah.
It's liberating, but it's also sobering. It's that we actually need to take it seriously.
This looks like that jugglery, right? The balance has to be just right, or else either side is dangerous for you.
Absolutely. And that's the brain. The brain is designed for homeostasis. The brain is designed for balance. So even cultures that have this insistence on academic reinforcement 7 days a week, where young children are forced to learn things that are actually that it's too many hours of the day are doing academic learning, there is no balance. And what happens, the emotional development of those children actually becomes retarded. I mean, the suicide rates in, and I won't even mention the countries, but in countries of that have this high or excessive focus on academic performance is enormous, because the emotional well-being of these teenagers, for example, it's not paid attention to. Exercise, engaging social downtime, quiet time, focusing time, all of these things are what the brain needs in order to function well. So actually we should pay, like we pay attention to the food pyramid of how many vegetables and what percentage meat or chicken or fish we should eat, or we pay attention to that, but we don't pay attention to the balance that our brain needs in order to be nutritionally healthy.
Very interesting. In fact, and thanks for that, because that's the segue to my next question. So what are some tools and techniques for the mental gym, or, to stay curious to learn at all times? One, of course, you said, we pay attention a lot to, so example, if we plan a trip, we ensure everything is set and there is a plan B for everything. But we don't do that often for our brain.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to angle my answer more towards learning.
Yes, please.
So first of all, I love the term you used, mental gym, because really what we should be doing is we should be doing physical work. And you might have heard of something called brain gym. So I teach youngsters, it's essentially at the heart of brain gym is, we call it crossing the midline. So you've got a line down the center of your body. Everything on the right is controlled by your left hemisphere. Everything on the left is controlled by your right hemisphere. Now, kids who sit and game, for example, they're sitting with their device and they're focusing forward, and they've got their left hand on the left side, the right hand on the right side in the midline. And it seriously impairs the effectiveness of their brain. So brain gym would be taking a kid, and I'm talking a kid, but adults, I do brain gym with adults as well. Putting your right elbow to your left knee, crossing your arms over from left-hand side to right-hand side. That would be brain gym. What we do with kids when they're having learning difficulties is we do, roly-polies on the grass and swinging and, movement. Whereas sitting and gaming for 7, 8, 9 hours is seriously retarding the effectiveness of the brain. Exercise as well. Your cerebellum, which is, if you have to put your hand right at the back of your head at the base, that's where your cerebellum exists. It's geographically smaller than a lot of other parts of the brain, but it contains 80% of the brain's neurons. 80% of the brain cells are in the cerebellum. Now, the cerebellum is to do with movement and balance. So if you see the correlation, we need exercise, we need movement. There's a thing called neurogenesis, which is the growth of new brain cells. So to facilitate that, we need to move. And then there's another substance that is emitted by the brain when we engage in physical activity. It's called brain-derived neurotropic factor, which is an essential element that needs to be present in order for learning to occur. So, I can give you lots of other tips about brain health, but I think exercise is really, really a priority for.
No, that's what, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, here's a small tip as well. If do things with your kids, absolutely. But if your child wants to learn something, okay, if your child comes to you and says, please show me what to do, or your direct report comes and says, please tell me how to do this, would you say to that child or that direct report, you say, why don't you go find out and come and teach me? There is no better way, Prashant, no better way to learn than to teach.
It's coincidence that you said this. Yesterday, my 3-year-old has taught me how to do headstand. So we saw something on the television, and I had learned this some years back, but I couldn't do it. So I said, let's do it together. And within no time, Colin, you won't believe, she did it and she told me how to do. And she said, she's 3 years, nothing, right? And she's
Yeah.
telling me that I'll hold you, don't worry, don't be afraid. It's just this way. And she was literally giving me instructions. And that was beautiful.
And she will never forget. I mean, yes, I'm thrilled for you that you learned.
I want to take your time to talk about something very important, and it's directly related with learning. It's called sleep.
Oh boy. Okay, we could do a whole podcast just on that. I'm passionate about it. Can I just throw some pointers out to you? Are
Yes,
you okay
please.
with that?
Sure, please.
Okay, so do not underestimate the brain. It is completely critical, not just for learning, but for good brain health. It's one of the most critical things, and we underestimate the importance of it. Obviously, people need different amounts of sleep. On average, we need about 8 hours. Some people need as much as 9 or 10. I know I'm an 8.5 hour sleeper. Some people are lucky enough to need 4 or 5 hours sleep, but you are genetically born with the amount of sleep you need, and you cannot change it. So please don't let anybody say you should only be sleeping 6 hours a night. In fact, it's actually a genetic abnormality to only be able to sleep 5 or 6 hours a night. Every time you do without sleep, you are sabotaging your brain health. Another thing in terms of learning is that learning occurs while we sleep. Isn't that amazing? So this is not to say that I can go a recording of my textbook and go put it under my pillow while I'm sleeping. But what it means is that the neural pathways bind while we sleep. Okay, so if I gave you something to learn now, and then I gave you a rest and I tested you, versus if I gave you something to learn now, I gave you a sleep and then I tested you, you would score way higher after sleeping. And then there's also a very important enzyme that is released only while we sleep. And that enzyme functions as a garbage collector, basically, in your brain. So your brain has got no lymphatic system.
Okay.
And scientists pondered for many years about how does a brain get rid of all its wastes, because our brain works off a whole lot of electrical chemical activity and byproducts from that. So how did the brain get rid of it? And they didn't know until they discovered there's this enzyme that actually almost acts like a little garbage collector in your brain, but only is emitted while you sleep. I could sit here for another hour and a half telling you about sleep. Please don't underestimate how important sleep is for every human brain, child or adult.
Brilliant. Yeah, and I knew that you would love this topic of firstly because you always explain this as the recharge system.
Great.
Okay, so we are getting into the next stage of this podcast where we have little different questions not related to brain or mind, uh, but these need to be rapid. So this is like a rapid fire round for you. Are you all set? Your position really has to be active in this.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
Right. So I'm sorry, due to budget issues, you win nothing. But at the same time, I promise you, whenever next you're in India, probably a coffee could be on me.
I will hold you to that, Prashant.
All right, thank you. Cheers. So first things first, what have you recently relearned?
What have I relearned? Well, something I've learned that I've never learned before, but I guess it always builds on what we haven't learned. So here, this is a fun one. Prashant, during lockdown, we had one of the most severe lockdowns in the world, pretty similar to India, actually.
Right.
And we weren't allowed to go out of our houses. And as you know, I'm an avid runner and cyclist, and I love moving fast.
Right.
And I decided to start yoga, which if you told me a year ago that I would do yoga, I would have fallen off my chair laughing. Anyway, so I started, and I started enjoying it, and it was quite interesting. And then I knew, because I know about neuroscience, I know that in order to create a new habit, we need to do it for a certain amount of time. And the generic the number that they're handing out at the moment from Harvard University is 66 days. So I set myself a 66-day challenge for doing yoga, and now it's a way of life. I do yoga every single day of my life. Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. Oh, very interesting.
Yeah, that's what I've just learned.
Superb. Thank you. And thank you for that answer, right? Perfect.
Yeah.
The next one is going to be interesting for me personally. So if you had a time machine, which era would you go and why?
So we're talking historical era.
It could be futuristic as well. It's a time machine, wherever you want to.
Okay. Sure. Okay. Sure. So I guess from a personal perspective, a sad reflection of me would be for when my brother passed away, and I don't believe he was given the opportunity for this kind of thinking, which is kind of why I was led to do the work I do. So I would take myself straight back there to prevent my brother passing, although that was probably his destiny anyway.
Uh-huh.
I had to take myself back to my first TED talk, which was in Hyderabad. It was
Yeah,
one of the highlights of my life. I think you've mentioned my second one, but that's my
yeah,
first one, which I told my life story.
yeah.
Historically, I think I would go all the way back, and this maybe I would go because I talk so much about our primal brain and that how our brain is actually designed to wander around the savannah, picking berries and fighting off saber-toothed tigers. So I'd love to go there and experience that. So prehistoric,
Very interesting.
if that would be possible. I don't want to go to the future, thank you. I think I don't. No.
Fair. Okay. Next one is what are
Yes.
your recommendation for a podcast, movie, or a book?
Okay, so I'm podcast mad. So Sam Harris,
Yeah.
he's a philosopher, he's an intellectual, spiritual from a perspective of mindfulness and meditation, not from a religious perspective. I find him truly brilliant and controversial. Sadhguru, I'm passionate about his work. I'm passionate about his presence, how he speaks from his past. I think any meditation apps, any presence apps. There's one called Moments, which tracks our use of digital devices. I'm keen on those because I don't think we're conscious enough about how we are not present in our lives, and I think that helps us become aware of that. So
Interesting.
yeah, books, probably the most influential book, not probably, without doubt, without question, the most influential book of my entire life has been Eckhart Tolle's, he wrote A Whole New Earth, The Power of Now.
Yeah.
No question that those two books have had the biggest influence on me of all books. From plain learning, I'm very keen on Tony Buzan. I think he's a genius. I've actually met him and engaged with him quite frequently. And
anything that you want our listeners to leave with, or end this session with?
I think really what I'm truly passionate about is helping people understand that learning can be fun, learning can be easy, learning is exciting, and we've got the capacity. I mean, really, Prashant, I failed my second last year of school. I really did not think I was in any way intelligent. I used to get like 19-20% for exams. I was a shocking learner. I got to university, I dropped out of university. I didn't know how to use my brain. Now I've got like 5 degrees and I learn all the time and I can't wait to see what's the next one. It's only because I've learned how to learn. So that's what I would say to everyone is that we need to teach teachers how to teach. We need to teach learners how to get excitement and have fun and embrace learning. And all human beings up till the age of 80, it's possible to change your learning experience.
Brilliant. And that's a perfect message. Thank you so much, Colin, for doing this. It's like I said, it's an honor for me to host you and be on this episode of the Relearning podcast. Thank you so much. This means a lot.
Thank you, Prashant. It was a great privilege to me. And you know that my heart is very much in India. In fact, most of my Indian friends think I was Indian in a previous life. So to connect with you today is very special for me as well.
Hope you enjoyed this conversation. Do tag the Relearning podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Until next time, this is Prashant Utekar. Keep relearning. Bye.